share my screen. Okay, so maybe.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SEMEA seminar series. As you all know, today we're joined by Professor Panagiotis Grammatikopoulos, who currently holds two positions. Firstly, as staff scientist at Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in Japan, and assistant professor at ETH Zurich. He is a materials scientist and a nanotechnologist whose research interests lie in the fundamental processes regarding nanoparticles, but also extend to device fabrication and applications. Professor Grammatikopoulos, thank you very much for joining us. And whenever you're ready, you can start.
Thank you very much for the invitation to start with and the introduction. As you said, I'm going to discuss a little bit about my research, which most of the things were what I did in Japan at the OIST. So in Japan, I was working, the unit closed down last year, but I was working for a group which was purely experimental, and I was the only person who was doing computer simulation. And this is what I'm going to show you today. And my presentation is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be mostly about designing nanoparticles, how to use computer simulation to design nanoparticles and specific structures and properties. And the second part is just a tiny glimpse of some of our applications, a little bit of the experimental idea, but also what you can do using computer simulations to help the experimental process. So if I may just give a second. So as I said, most of my work has been done at OIST's Nanoparticles by Design unit. OIST is the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in Japan, and more specifically in the southernmost island of Japan, in Okinawa. Now, Okinawa is an archipelago consisting of many islands, but the institute is located at the main island, the biggest island, and more specifically exactly at the center part of the island, the most narrow part, and here's exactly the location of the institute. Now, as you probably can see from this map, Okinawa is very urban in the southern side, and there is more like a jungle in the top, the northern side, and the institute is exactly at the border between the jungle and the huge urban area. This is a very outdated photo. You can see lab 1 on the left and lab 2 on the right of this picture. There are now lab 3 and 4 have already been built, and lab 5 is now currently being built. So it's an institute that's been expanding extremely fast over the past 10 years. And this is a promotional photo of our lab. This is the main instrument where we grow our nanoparticles, our nanoparticle deposition system. And here are some of the postdocs of the unit, and the professor of the unit, Professor Mukhle Sowan, and myself are posing in the background, pretending to be discussing something very serious scientific, whereas of course this is just a publicity photo. So our group utilized cluster beam deposition to grow our nanoparticles, the physical vapor deposition method. And the main idea is that there are plenty of different types of sources, just like thermal gas aggregation, laser ablation, sputter gas, and so on. Just let me get rid of it. Okay. Pulse microplasma, supersonic expansion, and arc cluster ion sources. All are similar types of sources. The main difference between them is the procedure that is used in order to pulverize bulk materials into individual atoms, which will then condense and create the nanoparticles. Our unit had a sputter gas aggregation source, and this is what we'll discuss about in the next few minutes. So this is what our nanoparticle source looks like. So we have a target of a material that we want to sputter, and we want to make the nanoparticles of, which is mounted on a magnetron gun. and then inert gas is introduced in the chamber. This is a high vacuum chamber. So inert gas is introduced and it's ignited as plasma. And then the ions, the charged ions of this plasma become very energetic and bombard the target. And as they do, they sputter atoms away from the target. These individual atoms are then cooled down by collisions with cold atoms from the same aggregation gas. And once they are cooled down, they manage to bond together and form the first cluster nuclei, then bigger clusters, and eventually the bigger nanoparticles. And the aggregation gas is also used as a carrier gas, which means that because of the pressure differential, it moves the clusters away from the target and creates the cluster beam, which then goes to the next chamber and is deposited depending on what the application is on specific supports and substrates. Just to give you a better idea of how this process looks like, there's a very short video. This is a schematic of the machine. And here's the inside, and you can see the magnetron gun on the left, the main chamber. There's a mass filter, which allows us to create a single size, a narrow size distribution of sizes. As you can see, we can mount up to 3 targets at the same time. And if you consider that some of these targets may be alloys, then you can imagine that the number of potential combinations of elements is huge. So once the clusters are formed, they enter the mass filter. It's a quadruple mass filter, which is using electric fields to deflect all the particles which are not in a specific size window. And then you end up with a cluster beam of particles which have more or less the same size. And we can have a quite narrow size distribution. And of course, in the end, the particles are deposited on the substrate, which is rotated so that you can get a more homogeneous deposition. So this is the main idea of the experimental setup. What I'm going to discuss first is how we can start from individual atoms and create the nanoclusters using computer simulation as a in order to understand the processes. And of course, I'm using the Lego brick analogy because nanoparticles are very often called as the building blocks for nano devices. You can use them as building blocks for nano devices. Okay, so here's the simulation setup. So when we want to simulate the nucleation and growth of the nanoparticles, what we usually do is we have a simulation box which has periodic boundaries, and inside the box we have individual atoms of a sputtered species, which in this case is silicon, and it's not very clear in the image, but you can see the red spots here indicate individual silicon atoms. And also the atoms from the inert gas, in this case is argon, and it's blue atoms here. When we start the simulation, the sputtered atoms are supposed to be hotter, more energetic, so we start with a high temperature for them. And we have introduced an idea that the argon gas atoms are rethermalized every time they go past the periodic boundaries of the box. So every time one argon atom leaves the box from one side and enters on the other side, its temperature is reset to a specific temperature that we want to use. In this case, most cases, it's room temperature, because all this process happens at room temperature. So every time an argon atom goes through the periodic boundaries, it represents a new atom which now has the temperature of the whole chamber, which is more or less room temperature. So here you can see the first set, the initial configuration, and after a while the atoms, the sputtered atoms, cool down, start bonding with each other, and create the primary clusters, which in this case, as you can see, two primary clusters have coalesced together and created this dumbbell-shaped nanoparticle. So this is what the simulation looks like in terms of visualization, but we also use diagnostics to figure out what's going on during this process. And two of the main diagnostics we use is the temperature and the potential energy per atom. So in this graph, you can see the temperature in red, and this is in this inset, it's the initial cooling, the first 2.5 nanoseconds. So you can see that the temperature of the silicon atoms is very high at the beginning, but very, very soon it goes down by collisions with cold argon atoms. And once it's reached the minimum temperature, then it's enough. The atoms are cold enough and slow enough to start making bonds with each other. So when they do, the potential energy of the system goes down because by convention, a chemical bond reduces the potential energy of the system. And since our system is more or less adiabatic, then the temperature of the system goes up. And that's why you have this spike here, which corresponds to bond formations. So every time a bond is formed, the overall temperature of the silicon, this temperature here corresponds only to the silicon atoms, the temperature goes up and creates this spike. Once you have some bigger clusters, they are still being bombarded by the cold argon atoms, and as such, they are cooling down. So there's always a fight between temperature increase because of bond formation and temperature decrease because of collisions with cold argon atoms. So they reach some equilibrium at this stage here, and then since the rate of adding extra bonds is decreased, the temperature of the whole system of silicon atoms is decreased. And you can also see some insets of the simulations here. And in the last one, you can see that this is exactly when the dumbbell was created. And you can see that there is a spike in the temperature, a step in the temperature, which corresponds to this creation of this coalesced nanoparticle. So this is the general setup when you have one individual element, but we were most interested in forming nanoalloys, and we have different setups. And the main challenge in this case from the simulation point of view is to create a setup, a simulation setup, which corresponds as accurately as possible to the experimental setup. So one of the experimental setups is when you are using more than one target, separate targets at the same time. And this is more or less schematically how the growth happens. So you start making nanoparticles of the two different elements separately, which eventually they mix together and create some binary nanoparticle. These are some systems we worked on during the last 8 years. And what I'm showing here is that there is this core shell final structure where the blue particle, the blue element, whatever this is, goes to the surface, and the red element stays in the core. This is just to indicate that there's a higher probability of segregated structures at the end of this process, but it doesn't necessarily mean that in all cases we ended up with segregated systems. It's just to indicate the higher probability. Another setup is when you can use first one target to grow the initial core material, which will then be decorated by elements from the other material. So see, this is how it happens. You form the clusters, and then you spatter an extra material using a sequential system, a sequential growth system, which then the second phase lands on the first particle, creating a shell, partial shell or satellites or whatever. We've done work on silicon silver system using this setup. The other idea is to use a composite target. So in this case, you have one target which is of this red material, whatever this is, And when you sputter, mostly almost all of the material is sputtered from a specific ring inside the target, which is called the racetrack. And if you introduce exactly at this place where the racetrack is supposed to happen, if you introduce pellets of another material, then you can have a composite target. And in this case, you sputter the two elements simultaneously from the same target in the same environment, and therefore the probability of reaching a nanoalloy, a non-segregated phase, is higher. You can have a similar setup if you use an alloy target. So in this case, I painted the target purple as to indicate the mixture of blue element and red element. So when it's an alloy, it's purple. And in this case, it's quite similar with a composite target. The nucleation and growth happens at the same place for all the materials, and then the probability of reaching having particles with an alloy or solid solution configuration is higher. That's why in both cases at the composite and the alloy target, I introduced the purple clusters just to indicate that the probability is higher. As I said earlier, it doesn't necessarily have to be like that, but the probability is usually higher for this type of configuration. So let me show you how the simulation works for this type of growth. So first, we start with two separate targets, and in this case, it's a case of silicon and silver. And we sputtered simultaneously from two separate targets. So in the simulation box, there are 500 silicon atoms and 500 silver atoms. You cannot see the colors now when they are very small, but as the clusters will start growing, you'll notice the most important feature in this simulation is that silicon and silver do not like each other very much. So they grow separately. And you'll soon start seeing that there are red particles and green particles, but there are no mixed red-green particles during the growth. I think it's becoming more clear now as it goes. And the important feature there is that the clusters do not like each other. And the only time when we actually had some mixed cluster formation was when the primary particles had already formed and they coalesced. One silver cluster coalesced with a silicon cluster. And we had a Janus type particle, a particle where one side was fully silver and the other side was fully silicon. It will happen very soon as you see the clusters are doing this Brownian motion in the box, and eventually they will coalesce, creating this mixed cluster, this binary Janus cluster. While this is happening, let me just introduce you to the setup of the second type. Oh, it's already happened. Yeah, it's over there. So you can see this mixed by Janus cluster. So the second simulation corresponds to the post-growth shell coating using this shell coater apparatus in our system. And the simulation is actually using exactly the same type of atoms. So in this case, we have preformed silicon clusters, and then we bombard these silicon clusters with silver atoms. Because the pressure in the chamber is much lower, the silver does not have a chance to form nanoparticles by itself. So what happens is that silver atoms penetrate the silicon cluster, and they precipitate inside the cluster. And silver has a much lower surface energy than silicon, which means that the precipitates do not want to stay inside the silicon cluster, so they segregate to the surface. And as they do that, they actually induce crystallization for the silicon cluster. Initially, the silicon cluster was amorphous, and with this process, the silicon cluster crystallizes. And this is important because you can actually crystallize silicon clusters this way, even when they are too small to be crystalline by themselves. when we try to grow purely silicon clusters, we found that the probability of having crystalline clusters is much lower when you go down with the size. So the probability increases when the size increases. But using silver inoculation for these clusters, you end up with a crystalline structure. I don't have simulation for this case, but it's what we grew using iron and gold nano targets, composite target of iron with gold pellets in it. So the two materials grew together, and we managed to get iron mixed, gold mixed inside the iron particles, which is a non-favorable, energetically non-favorable configuration. In principle, gold should have wanted to segregate to the surface and decorate specific sites in the iron cubes. I'm going to discuss about this case in a few slides later. But the main idea here is that you can, using this setup, you can make something which is very unfavorable thermodynamically. Of course, I'm not going into details here because I don't want to go, because it would be too much information, but we have found some kinetics arguments on how we can make iron particles of cubic shape using the different growth rates of different facets of our nanoparticles. So if you manage to enhance the growth of one type of facets at the expense of another, then you can end up with a cluster which has only 100 type facets, which is a cube with 100 surfaces. And this is how we could make iron cubes. And this is the alloy formation of iron gold nanocubes. And finally, there is the case of nickel chromium. This is using an alloy target, and the simulation setup is very similar to the one I showed you for silver and silicon on the top left side of this slide. The main difference here is that the two types of atoms like each other, so they grow together. So you start very early on by having mixed nanoparticles. And this corresponds very well to the experimental setup where atoms spattered from an atom are already in the same thermal environment and they nucleate together, creating mixed nanoparticles. Of course, then the two phases may segregate post-growth. And here, let me show you a little bit of our experimental results to see how they compare with the simulation. So in the first case of silicon silver clusters, you can see that we have these Janus particles. For example, in these Hadaf stem images, the different intensity, different brightness indicates different elements. So silver is the bright spots and silicon is the darker, the gray spot. And when there's enough silver, the particles grow in the Janus form. If the silver content is lower, then you end up with some kind of core satellite structure, which physically speaking, in principle, is the same as the Janus. The only thing that's different is the concentration of silver. So very specific segregated configuration where the silicon cluster, the silicon core remains amorphous, not affected by the silver satellites. Now, when you have the second setup where silver individual atoms precipitate inside and then go to the surface, they induce crystallization. And this is very clearly indicated. It's not very clear because the images are quite small, but if you go, you notice that the number of silver satellites corresponds exactly to the crystalline domains in the core of the silicon nanocluster. The idea is that as each one of these satellites goes to the surface, it induces crystallization in the area around it. And the other one creates another crystallite and another crystallite. And we have done extensive TEM surveys in our system, and we found that every single time the number of crystalline domains in its core nanocluster coincided with the number of satellites in the end. So exactly the same material, the two structures look the same. I'm talking about the two cases presented here, but the physical mechanism is completely different, and the end result is also different because of this different mechanism. Now this is the EDX line scan and the high resolution TM image of these iron gold nanocubes, where you can see that there's gold all over the nanoparticles. So there's no decoration of specific sites in the nanocluster, which is the normal thing, as I'm going to show you a bit later. And of course, this is the nickel chromium case, where you can see EELS elemental maps of clusters, and you can see the segregation of chromium on the surface. Of course, this is experimental image, so there's also oxidation here. It's a little bit more complicated than what I showed you in the simulation. Now, using this main setup, we wanted to go one step further and make our model a little bit more sophisticated. So we simulated and also did experiment on the growth of trimetallic gold, platinum, palladium nanoparticles. And the main result we found in this study is that the nucleation rate varies with element. And because of this reason, the nucleation rate can affect the size of the clusters and also can affect the chemical order of the nanoalloys. So this is our simulation setup. It's more or less the same as the one I showed you before, but the difference here is that each simulation box for single element nucleation growth is separated from each other to start with. And once the initial primary clusters were created, then we allowed the simulation boxes to mix with each other, and the atoms from the different elements to mix with each other. In doing so, we simulated the fact that the three targets are separate, and the initial spattered atoms do not mix immediately with each other. And we checked the evolution of the system, and we found something extremely interesting. These are images, visualization images of the simulations after 100 of nanoseconds of growth. And as you can see, palladium, and these are the diagnostics, the temperature and the potential energy of the spattered atom. And as you can see, palladium nanoparticles form faster than gold or platinum. So here in blue, you can see that after 100 nanoseconds, we had palladium nanoparticles, which are almost fully grown, whereas platinum nanoparticles are stuck in binary form. So you have only platinum dimers. So all the platinum atoms have managed to create one bond with each other. So they're only in dimer form, but there are no bigger clusters. Gold is something in between. So gold is there are some clusters of gold, slightly larger, and there are also some dimers, some atoms which are stuck in dimer form. So gold is something in between. And this corresponds to, you can detect this from the diagnostics. So if you go, for example, in the temperature of gold here on the left-hand side, you'll see that there is this temperature spike, which corresponds to the formation of dimers. The same spike exists for platinum. It's actually even more pronounced for platinum. But this initial spike does not exist with palladium. And the reason is that theoretically this spike exists, but since palladium clusters grow so fast, this spike of the creation of dimers merges with one for the creation of trimers, one for the tetramers, and so on. So in principle, you end up having a big, wide peak here, whereas for the case of dimer formation, you only have this very narrow and spike for the creation of the dimers. And in the case of gold, you can see that there's a wider and lower peak, which corresponds to the growth of the rest, the bigger size clusters. So there's something very different between gold, palladium, and gold or platinum. So we investigate the nucleation kinetics, and we measured the potential energy per atom as a function of a number of atoms for small clusters. And what we found is that with interatomic potentials that we used, and we tried two different interatomic potentials just to have a better understanding of the idea, there was a fluctuation of stability. So for platinum and gold. So for platinum, you can see here that the stability, which means low potential energy per atom, is quite high, is stable when you have a dimer, but the stability is decreased when you go to trimer. And then if you add another atom and go to tetramer, then this is also decreased again, and there is this oscillation between stable and unstable structures. The same thing happens for gold, but it's less pronounced. So you can see that going from dimer to trimer, there is some energy barrier, and then this barrier becomes much less significant when we go for bigger clusters. Whereas for palladium, the stability is the evolution of stability with cluster growth is monotonic. So in principle, a trimer is more stable than the dimer, a tetramer is more stable, and so on and so forth. And this is a good explanation why, at least in our simulated system, the gold and platinum clusters, mostly the platinum clusters, stay stuck in this dimeric formation. And here's some of the final nanoparticles that we got from the simulation, from the MD. These are the structures, and you can see that we mostly got icosahedral nanoparticles and truncated octahedral quasi-spherical nanoparticles with FCC structure. And then we did Monte Carlo simulation to establish what are the equilibrium states for nanoparticles of our sizes. And we found that there was a good agreement, a relatively good agreement between our MD nanoparticles and the stable structures as obtained by Monte Carlo. And the main idea here is that our simulated nanoparticles managed more or less to reach equilibrium and to get the final structure which corresponds to the energetically favorable configuration. This was not exactly the case for the experimental clusters. So here you can see some high resolution TM micrographs on the top layer, on the top row here. And you can see that you have the FCC cluster, icosahedral or decahedral nanoparticles. So our simulation managed to reproduce very well these structures. You had either the FCC structure in the simulation or some twinned particles with a fivefold twin axis. So the physical ordering was reproduced quite accurately in the simulation. Where we didn't get exactly full agreement was with the chemical ordering, because as you can see from the stem Haddaf micrographs on the bottom row, the particles were stuck in some non-favorable configuration. So they didn't manage to reach the favorable configuration as obtained by the Monte Carlo. And the reason for that is that the particles, as they go in the main chamber where they're deposited on the support, they are quenched. So if they haven't reached some thermodynamically stable structure by then they are stuck in some metastable configuration. And since their sizes are mostly bigger than the simulated ones, it takes longer to reach the equilibrium. Now, the last step in the growth process is nanoparticle coalescence. Here is a case of silver copper nanoparticles. So blue is a small silver nanoparticle which coalesces with a bigger copper nanoparticle which has a truncated octahedral shape. And what we found extremely interesting here is that the silver nanoparticle is losing out, the atoms are diffusing on the surface of the copper nanoparticle. And more interestingly, that they avoid at all costs to go to 1-1-1 type surfaces. So you can see the particles, the atoms are diffusing along the edges or along the 1-1-0 or 1-1-0 type facets, but they refuse to stay on the 1-1-1 type facets. And this is something that no one had observed before. It was a first time observation, only in the simulation. But since then, we actually observed exactly, or very, very similar case for nickel platinum nanoparticles, where you can see here the platinum is the platinum atoms are the bright spots, and as you can see, they are decorating specifically the edges of this roughly truncated octahedral nickel core, avoiding the facets. This is something we haven't published yet. I'm actually drafting the paper now these days, but the main idea is that we managed to predict this type of patterned partial core shell structure even before we had observed it experimentally, and I don't think anyone has, even to this day. Of course, I showed you some various mechanisms, but more than one can be at play at the same time. So here is an overview of what could happen. This is the case of iron gold that I told you about earlier, but here, unlike the case where I showed you with the composite target, this is a case where we use two separate targets, one for gold and one for iron, or actually two for iron and one for gold. So what happens here is that first you see that the clusters nucleate separately. So you have the nucleation of monometallic clusters, as I explained in the beginning of this presentation. And also iron will grow into cubes, as I briefly mentioned. And gold, because it's very slow to nucleate, will grow smaller clusters. Then when the two types of clusters will coalesce, the smaller one will wet the surface of the bigger one. So you have gold atoms diffusing on the surface of the iron nanocubes. And then because there is plenty of other iron atoms in the chamber, they will still keep on decorating the chamber, the particles, and the gold will want to go to the surface, the gold atoms, and they will create a core frame morphology. So the atoms will decorate the vertices and the edges. And as you can see in this schematic here, and in the end, we'll end up with some multiple frame morphologies, which can be quite exotic. So as you can see, we have these multiple nanocates of gold trapped inside the iron nanocube. So this is a very complicated structure. Not all our clusters looked exactly like this, but most of the clusters had a single nanocade, but we ended up with plenty of them having a multiple nanocades, which we managed to explain by atomistic computer simulation. So this is a main idea of what we did in terms of designing nanoparticles. And of course, from the experimentalist point of view, of the application point of view is, so what are you going to do with these nanoparticles? Why you want them? We have worked on very many different applications, mostly sensors, gas sensors, biosensors. Recently, we produced a very interesting structure for lithium-ion battery anodes made of silicon, amorphous silicon. I decided just to show you one example of potential application. And this is what I call design by nanoparticles. So the first part is how you design the nanoparticles. The second is how you design devices or nanostructures using these nanoparticles. we can create two-dimensional films, 3D structures, nanodevices. One of the main advantages of the experimental procedure is that the whole procedure is CMOS compatible, so you can actually deposit your nanoparticles on the devices that you can then use for different types of applications, like sensing applications and so on. And one of the most important features of all this process is the cluster surface interaction. The main advantage of using physical method to grow your nanoparticles is that you can create a very clear interface between the support and the cluster. This is the main advantage of our method compared with chemically grown nanoparticles, which can be much higher in yield. You can grow much more nanoparticles using chemical methods. You can have good control. You can the method is cheaper than ours, but you cannot create this type of pure interface which you can completely control by chemical method. So what I'm going to show you is how you can use nanoparticles as nanoportals for hydrogen storage and for electrocatalysis applications. So for those who are in the field of hydrogen storage, one of the most promising materials for hydrogen storage is magnesium. So in most cases, you try to hydrogenate magnesium films. And the advantage is that magnesium is, it has a very high mass capacity for hydrogen. And when it absorbs hydrogen, it transforms from hexagonal magnesium to tetragonal magnesium hydride. Of course, there are problems. One of the problems is the very slow hydrogen absorption kinetics. The whole process is not as fast as we would like it to be. And of course, the desorption requires quite high temperature. So some years ago, a potential answer was given, a solution to this problem by adding a palladium layer on top of a magnesium film. So you add an extra thin film, very thin film of palladium on top of the magnesium film. Now, palladium is a catalyst, so it can dissolve the molecular hydrogen into atomic hydrogen and can help it penetrate the film. But the problem was that, first of all, the film, the magnesium nanofilm, suffered from a blocking effect, which means that exactly underneath the palladium layer, there is a magnesium hydride layer, which is more difficult for extra hydrogen to penetrate. So it reduces the speed of the process. And of course, because of the large amount of palladium, there are intermetallic compounds being formed at the interface, which also different stress strains create delamination of the film after a few sorption cycles. So in principle, the structure was promising, but still problematic. So a few years ago, Bruce Clements' group at Stanford University suggested the using of nanoparticles, palladium nanoparticles, instead of full palladium film, to assist the catalytic splitting of the hydrogen atom molecule into atoms. And the advantages are numerous. For example, palladium clusters are more catalytically active than palladium film because of the small volume, the high surface to volume ratio. Of course, because of the low amount of palladium, the compressive stress are limited, delamination is prevented, and so on. And also, very little alloy formation was observed in this case. And of course, one of the main advantages is that the price was much lower because the palladium is quite expensive. So the less material, the less palladium you use, the better. So we also worked on this in this field, and we used the advantage of our flexibility of our system. So the experimental procedure goes like this. First, we use an RF sputtering gun to grow a thin film of magnesium on our target. So this is grown directly in the main deposition chamber. And then we use our cluster source to create palladium clusters, which are then deposited on top of the magnesium film. And once we did that, and we allowed this to hydrogenate, we could take to an AFM and observe the hydrogenation, because when magnesium hydride is formed, because of the absorption of hydrogen, it expands in volume, so you can actually observe the hydrogenation by measuring the volume, the protrusions that are created. Now, one of the biggest advantages of this is that you can let your system oxidize before you start the hydrogenation. And therefore, the mechanism is like this. The hydrogen molecule dissociates on the palladium nanoparticle. And then if the palladium nanoparticle is deposited after oxidation, the magnesium oxide layer acts as a block. It suppresses the hydrogen diffusion in the magnesium film. If the palladium nanoparticle is deposited before oxidation, then we have created what is called an open nanoportal. So hydrogen atoms can penetrate and diffuse into the underlying magnesium film. And once this happens, the protrusion is created because of the hydride expansion. And of course, there might be an auxiliary spillover mechanism because of this protrusion exposing magnesium hydride film above the surface of the magnesium oxide. Of course, this had been described before, but no one had actually proven it by theory. So what we did extensive DFT study in the system, and we calculated the energy barriers for hydrogen to penetrate the interface in all these different structures. So on the top layer here in this graph, you can see the barrier for hydrogen to diffuse through the interface of magnesium, of a palladium magnesium. So the red atoms here correspond to palladium atoms, and the beige brown are the magnesium atoms. And we calculate the barrier for the hydrogen atom to go through the interface. This is the same for magnesium oxide. The blue atoms here are oxygen atoms, so palladium magnesium oxide barrier, and here the palladium magnesium hydride. And when you take these barriers and put them all in the same graph together at the bottom, you can see that there is in principle practically no barrier for hydrogen to penetrate the palladium magnesium metallic interface. There is some significant barrier between palladium and magnesium hydride, the one in the graph here. But when we're talking about palladium magnesium oxide, the barrier becomes even higher, so it's almost prohibitive. And this corresponds to a closed nanoparticle. And this we reported in 2019 in Advanced Energy Materials, where we actually got the cover, like inside cover feature of the journal. Now, this was some project that we worked on specifically for hydrogen storage, but a few years later, we wanted to work on electrochemistry. And the current trend in electrochemistry is to use single nanoparticle electrochemistry, perhaps even single atom electrochemistry. How to and the challenge here is how to actually create this single nanoparticle electrodes. So originally the idea we had was to to take a pipette, fill it with magnesium, break the edge of the glass so that the rest of the pipette is insulated, but the top there is magnesium exposed, metallic magnesium exposed, and then deposit nanoparticles and hope that one of these will land on the surface and create this electrode there through the interface of metallic interface. But then we realized that we didn't need to do this because we already had exactly a system which is doing exactly this, creates this metallic interface. And this is exactly the structure that we use for our hydrogen storage application. We could use exactly the same architecture for single nanoparticle electrochemistry. So in principle, the idea is exactly the same as before. When you deposit the palladium nanoparticle on an oxidized magnesium film, you have a closed nanoportal, and therefore you don't get a signal. But if you deposit the palladium nanoparticle and you create an open nanoportal, so it's before oxidation, then if you use some conductive AFM measurements on each of the nanoparticles, then you can create a single nanoparticle electrode. And as soon as you touch the particle with the AFM tip, it lights up as if it's a small light bulb. So you can actually detect every single nanoparticle, every single open nanoportal using this method. And the main advantage is that you do your measurement, your current measurement, and you get your signal. And the signal that you get is derived from the ensemble of the overall film. So if you have 50, let's say, open nanoportals, you get a signal which is based on the each and every one of these electrodes. But exactly because of the oxidation in between the nanoparticles, all the nanoportals are decoupled from each other. So what happens in one nanoportal does not affect what happens with the other. So in principle, if you take the overall signal and divide it by the number of open nanoportals, then you can have the exact contribution of every single electrode, nanoparticle electrode. And this way you can circumvent the main challenge of having very low signal to noise ratio for these measurements by having a higher signal, but you can attribute the exact contribution of each of these open nanoportals without any real problem. So this is a current trend in single nanoparticle electrochemistry. And we did, as before, quite detailed DFT calculation to demonstrate this difference between open and closed nanoportals. And so our particles were either HCP structure, hexagonal close packed, or icosahedral. And on the left here, we managed to reproduce specific structures that we got from our TM characterization. And on the right, the same. And so here on the top, let's say in this figure on the right-hand side of the icosahedral nanoparticle, is the palladium nanoparticle on magnesium surface. And on the bottom is a palladium nanoparticle on the magnesium oxide surface. The palladium nanoparticle is charged by 4 negatively charged with 4 negative charges of 4 electrodes in principle, which are distributed inside the cluster because of as a result of the oxygen evolution reaction which happens on the surface. And as you can see, when we have the palladium nanoparticle on the magnesium film, the charge distribution is very much distorted at the interface, and it acts as a voltage inside along the thickness of the magnesium film, and helps the movement of charge carriers inside the film. Whereas in the case of the magnesium oxide, which is an insulator or wide gap semiconductor, the electric charge distribution is not really affected by the charged nanoparticle on top of it, as you would expect for a non-metallic material, and therefore the actual presence of the charged palladium nanoparticle on the surface of the film does not affect the behavior of the film, which still remains insulating, and therefore it acts. This structure acts as a closed nanoportal or a non-active electrode, whereas the top one is an open nanoportal and therefore an active single nanoparticle electrode. So through this simulation, we managed to identify the exact behavior and explain it. This is just to give you an idea of some of the work that we have done over the past 8 years at OIST in Japan. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Grammatikopoulos. We will stop recording now, so please feel free to ask any questions you may have.